You've finalized your questionnaire for your survey research project, and now it's time for you to start interviewing. Great! But before you pick up a clipboard or your phone, you should have a better understanding of what's involved in interviewing. This video lecture will focus on the roles of interviewers, errors in surveys related to interviewing, and the standardized interviewing process with an emphasis on interviewer training. The role of the interviewer goes beyond just asking questions and writing down or entering in a respondent's answer onto a computer screen. It starts well before that, as when you are an interviewer, it is your job to locate respondents and get them to grant an interview. No small task. It's easy to get discouraged when you ask someone to participate in a survey only to have that person respond with a curt, "Sorry, I don't have the time right now." And that's when they're being nice to you. It's even more disheartening when you finally get someone to agree to participate, only to discover that they don't meet the screens. They aren't in the right age group, or they don't own a home, and you need to talk to homeowners, or they don't attend college, and your study is about college students. Then you have to go through the process of going through another set of refusals before you get another potential respondent to screen to determine if they're eligible to participate. This is one of the reasons many people don't want to become telephone interviewers, whether it be for legitimate survey research or for non-survey research purposes, like telemarketers. But your job as an interviewer doesn't only entail these two responsibilities. Once an interviewer has granted permission and has started answering your questions, you must also train and motivate the respondent to do a good job of being a respondent. Now, the motivation part is pretty self-explanatory. You may have to encourage them by saying, "We're almost done," or "We really appreciate your answers." Oftentimes, you need to develop some sort of rapport with the respondent so that they find the interviewer enjoyable and are more likely to continue. But what do I mean by training respondents? You may have a series of questions with the same response categories, such as very important, somewhat important, or not important. It takes time to keep repeating these possible responses, not to mention being very repetitious. You may need to train respondents so that after the first 2 or 3 questions with these response categories, you can stop repeating yourself and the respondent will volunteer with a somewhat important. Or you might need to train respondents to provide more information than just a one-word answer. Which leads us to the next one, which is probing incomplete answers to ensure that the answers meet the question objectives. Say you're interviewing about people's perceptions of crime, and one question is, what is the #1 issue facing your city today? The respondent replies with crime. You will need to probe to ask, what kind of crime? And many times a response of don't know or undecided needs to be probed with something like, "I know it may be difficult, but can you think of an issue that you feel is really important that is facing your city now?" And finally, respondents are people, and they are likely to have questions or objectives that you will have to address, such as, "How long is the survey going to take?" or "I don't understand why you're asking this question." And you have to do all this while maintaining the appearance of a positive attitude. We've probably already addressed errors in survey research, so you are likely aware not only that errors are inherent in all research, but you know the various types of errors. Now, the two that most closely connect to interviewing are non-response error and measurement error. Non-response error is associated with the interviewer's responsibility of motivating respondents and enlisting their cooperation in the study. It affects whether the study's sample is representative, while measurement error is related to asking the questions and conducting the interview. Interviewers can contribute to non-response error by cherry-picking their respondents, interviewing people they know, those who look and sound like they might do the interview, and so on. If you can't get respondents to agree to and complete interviews, then the sample is also likely to be unrepresentative. And of course, if you make up interviews, fabricate them, rather than actually conducting them, the survey will be riddled with error. Now, when you are actually conducting the interview, oftentimes even a slight variation in question wording might lead the respondent to answer a question differently. Probing directively means that you are leading a respondent to answer a particular way. In our example about the survey topic of gangs, if the respondent says the #1 issue facing his area is crime, and you follow up with, "Would that be related to gangs, or drugs, or something else?" then you are probing. But you are, as would be claimed in court, leading the witness. In your effort to develop rapport and trust with a respondent, you may inadvertently bias the respondent's answers. If the respondent says, for example, "There's a lot of gang-related crime in my area," and you respond with, "Yeah, that's a big problem," that may affect his answers to future questions, and sometimes even an emphasis on a particular word may bias the respondent's answers. And of course, if you are careless in recording the answers, I'm sure many students have, on occasion, when taking a Scantron test, accidentally skipped a question or recorded two answers on the same question, which definitely contributes to measurement error on their test scores. One way to reduce measurement error is to have the same person conduct all of the interviews, because, after all, it would reduce any variation in responses based upon who is conducting the interview. Now that is really impractical because most surveys involve interviewing more than 200 people, difficult for one person to do alone, even if you had the time to actually conduct all of those interviews. Well, an easy way to minimize error based upon interviewer variability is to have all of the interviews conducted by computers, but that's very impersonal and would likely result in more non-response errors. It's much easier to turn down a computer who has no feelings than it is to turn down a real live person. And this leads us to standardized interviewing, which is an attempt to monitor and reduce errors related to measurements when we are gathering data via interviewers. Standardized interviewing is just that, standardizing the interviewing process so that regardless of who is doing the interviews, the questions are asked the same way. First and foremost, questions should be read exactly as worded. When you're interviewing, you can't change the way a question is worded because the wording is awkward, doesn't fit your style, or you're bored with asking a question the same way every time. This extends to reading the entire question. You can't, for example, ask a question such as, "How would you rate the City Council's effectiveness in addressing gang-related problems in your area as excellent, good, fair, or poor," but only say, "How would you rate the City Council's effectiveness in addressing gang-related problems in your area as excellent?" Then you would be leaving off additional responses, again potentially leading a respondent to an answer. And this is one reason so much care is taken in questionnaire design, including being specific in transitions between questions. Okay, now let's move on to a different topic, as well as interviewer instructions. Practice using non-directive probing for clarification and elaboration, such as, "How do you mean that? Tell me more about that. Can you think of anything else? Can you be more specific?" Or, "When you say crime, what do you mean?" All of those are probing, but not directing a respondent to an answer. And you should record answers as they are given by the respondent. Don't read anything into the respondent's answers, even if it sounds like it non-verbally that they agree with something. Only record agree if they say they agree. And finally, you want to communicate a neutral, non-judgmental stance with respect to the substance of the respondent's answers. So don't agree nor disagree with the respondent, and don't provide feedback that could potentially be misconstrued. To be able to do all of this, you will likely be involved in some sort of interviewer training. Training is important because it affects the interviewer's orientation to the job, his or her skills, the way interviewers relate to respondents, and conversely, the way respondents react to them, which ultimately reflects upon the quality of the data collected. Training can be general, which teaches the interviewing process overall, or specific to the project. Oftentimes an interviewer manual is used to explain the overall process to interviewers, explaining protocols, giving examples, even providing a list of probing responses and answers to frequently asked questions. Sometimes this is supplemented by or replaced by a video training. Potential interviewers might also be required to sit through lectures and demonstrations, as well as practicing interviewing techniques with a generic questionnaire. When it comes to an actual project, there's likely going to be some sort of training session that explains the study's purpose, types of questions, potential pitfalls, and even goes over how to pronounce certain words or names. Many times, a project-specific interviewer guide is prepared so that interviewers have something they can refer to when they have questions. Frequently, the training involves supervised practice, where interviewers pair up and practice interviewing each other to get the flow of the questionnaire and discover any flaws that may exist in the survey instrument, or potentially even some awkward wording. Usually, Usually a survey is pre-tested, meaning that interviewers conduct a small number of live interviews. This not only tests out the questionnaire and the survey sample, but gives the interviewer more practice. During the project, additional training may take place, where the interviewers are monitored by a supervisor, listening in on telephone interviews or observing actual intercept interviews, with feedback to ensure quality and consistent interviewing both in the project as well as overall. And sometimes a client will listen in on actual telephone interviews to hear how the interviewer is actually conducting the interview. After the interview, follow-up calls may be made to confirm that interviews were indeed conducted and that the interviewer was courteous and professional. Responses are regularly checked for accuracy and at times consistency. Data gathered from these after-interview checks are regularly used in the evaluation and feedback process, leading us back to general training. Processing time. What are the roles of an interviewer in survey research? Of the types of error involved in survey research, which is or which are the most closely connected to interviewing? And what is the purpose of standardized interviewing? Now, before you go out and conduct your first interview, make sure you and your fellow interviewers conduct a good training session, because it will not only help you conduct good research, but it will most likely increase your confidence and comfort with the interviewing process.